Officially, you may have heard we are recording this program, so it will be available on YouTube not terribly long after this program. And just to recap, my name is Lacey Villava. I am with Gunston Hall today. I am joined by my colleagues, Patrick Campbell, who is representing Montpelier, and Rebecca Martin, who is representing Gunston Hall. They're our experts this evening. I will be our moderator and keeping an eye on the chat and the Q&A section if anybody has any thoughts or questions that they'd like to share with our panelists tonight. And just to give you a tiny preview of what we're working on and what we're doing today, we are looking at agree, disagree, or compromise. These are all things that George Mason and James Madison did within their lifetimes as they were helping to shape the Virginia Constitution, Virginia Declaration of Rights, the National Constitution, and subsequently, and what we're focusing on tonight, the United States Bill of Rights. So get ready, join us for this really amazing conversation about a huge disagreement that resulted in something really spectacular. Rebecca, did you want to get us started with our topic for the evening?
Sure. So when we think about the Bill of Rights today, many of us just kind of take for granted that it was always considered a good idea and that it was part of the original plan for the Constitution. That's not the case. In fact, there were a lot of people who thought we simply didn't need a Bill of Rights. And what we're going to tell today is the story of how we ended up getting that document added to our federal Constitution. So it starts with two guys who had known each other for a long time and had developed a relationship. They had worked together for a while. They had a fair amount of respect for each other, I think it's fair to say. And were people who agreed early in the career, at least of one of them, sort of mid-career for the other, and then had this enormous disagreement that we'll talk about in a little bit, and then eventually came to a compromise that has, I think it's fair to say, been really important to all of us. And as we are celebrating this Bill of Rights Day, it's pretty exciting to be looking at that story of how the Bill of Rights came to be. So I'm going to start us off by taking us back to some of the words of the period and to give you a little bit of an idea of how George Mason felt about James Madison. I want to share with you a quotation from one of his letters. So this is George Mason writing to James Madison saying, essentially, I'm really kind of sad that you weren't at this event that we had, this meeting, because it would have been really great to have you there. You can see he says, we thought ourselves unfortunate in being deprived of your assistance in this important business. And to me, it shines really clearly this respect that George Mason had for James Madison, how much he valued James Madison's contributions and his opinions, and how disappointed he was that at this particular gathering, Madison wasn't able to be there. And so he felt that the result was the poor for that lack. So Patrick, do you want to share a little bit of how Madison felt about Mason?
Well, I think Madison likes to return the compliment. He will say, as he's in his late 80s, I was acquainted with the genius, the opinions, and the public labors of Colonel Mason. He sustained the high character of a powerful reasoner, a profound statesman, and a devoted Republican. A nice sentiment looking back on this, Colonel Mason, who had died over 30 years earlier. But I think we're going to get into Mason really launches Madison in a political career. Madison's a sharp guy. I think he's kind of bookish. He's done really well. But when he's 25 years old, he meets Mason in Williamsburg. And I think that's just pivotal for Madison's development.
Yeah, so if we go back to those early days of the Revolution, the 5th Virginia Convention is meeting in Williamsburg to do something pretty important, to transition from the the government for a colony and to become a state. And so both Mason and Madison were delegates to this group, and Mason was somebody who had a really impressive reputation in Virginia as one of the leading thinkers about political ideology, about government and about political theory. And so he was one of the people who was really considered an important mind, an important speaker, and an important contributor to have at that Fifth Virginia Convention. So there he is, this guy who had this sterling reputation. I don't know, he had a reputation for being a really great thinker and contributor. He also had a reputation for being a little grumpy sometimes. So there he is. He's at the Fifth Virginia Convention, arrived a little late. And do you want to tell a little bit then about how the two interacted, Patrick?
Well, Madison gets chosen to that convention at the age of 25. Now, he's done superbly at Princeton, completes college in 2 years. He's in this debating society, the Whig Society, and here's this guy who's 105, 110 pounds. I think he's 5'2", because at 110 pounds, I don't think he's 5'4". But he's done well in debates. And then he comes back and he's in Orange County, which is gorgeous. And what do you do in Orange County if you're a white son of a plantation owner? You figure out how to make money off of enslaved labor. I mean, this is very different from Princeton. At Princeton, he's talking about natural law, natural rights. He's talking about John Locke and Baron de Montesquieu and engaging in all these philosophical things. And he's come back to Orange County, and he's kind of representing some religious dissenters because they're not Anglicans, they're not later after 1776, they're not Episcopalians, but he's a local guy. And he gets sent to the state capital of the largest colony by population and wealth. And he's 25, and he meets Mason, who's in his 40s. And I think he's astounded that not just that Mason's a thinker, but the guy can knock out some drafts in a hurry. So maybe, Rebecca, this is just an incredible feat to call him the father of the Virginia Constitution. Tell us a little bit more about Mason and just putting things together in a hurry there at that convention.
Well, so I mentioned he showed up late. And when he got there, the way I always think about it is that people there already said, well, it's good to see you, George. We put you on a committee. And he didn't know James Madison yet, really, right? The story is, and he recounted this to one of his colleagues in a letter, he looked at the other people on the committee and he decided that it was, and this is a quotation, overcharged with useless members. So instead of doing a group project of writing the Virginia Declaration of Rights, that's what the committee was tasked with doing, he just went and wrote the whole thing himself. Apparently he went to Raleigh Tavern in Williamsburg and he sat down and he just knocked out the draft. And then he presented it to the committee, and they made some changes. We might talk about that in a moment. And then the committee presented the entire thing to the rest of the convention, and they adopted it with a few more changes. And then after that, Mason kept going. It was time to write a constitution proper. This was essentially the preamble, or the preface to the Constitution. And so a bunch of people wrote their drafts of the Virginia Constitution and presented it to the rest of the convention. And Mason was one of those people, and his was the Constitution, the draft that was adopted by the convention. And again, they made some changes, but he's the one who sat down, as you said, and just knocked out these documents pretty quickly. He had a lot of ideas already formed about what he thought Virginia's government should look like. So there he is, writing these drafts really quickly, presenting to the rest of the people on the committee, and then getting his ideas passed along to the rest of the convention.
Well, I know you've got on your website that draft from May, and this Declaration of Rights is going to be adopted in June. And when you compare those two, it's just, wow, there's not a whole lot of edits. It's 90% Mason. Madison at 25 does have one big claim to fame here. And I think he's looking at Mason, the guy who can put things into words and practicality very quickly, build on the English tradition. But Mason says government should have the fullest toleration of the exercise of religion. And I think this is where the bookish Madison gets to show his hand, like, wait a minute, I think I learned something at Princeton. And he's saying rights don't come from the government, not a natural right like religion. And for religion, it shouldn't be fullest toleration, Colonel Mason. It needs to be free exercise. So as far as we know, that's Madison's big contribution, only substantive contribution, but an important one in terms of recognizing where rights come from. So you see these politicians working together with Mason's strength, I think, of really, let's put it down on paper and get this done. Revolution's going, right? There's people risking their lives already. And Madison getting this one little piece that he can get accepted, and little but important piece.
We've been talking over the last few weeks about these two guys and their relationship and some of the similarities and differences between them. And one of the things that we've noted that we found pretty interesting has to do with religion in their personal lives, that both of them married someone from outside of their own faith. George Mason's second wife was Catholic. That was not so common in Virginia in the late 18th century, and was a little bit risky in some ways for someone who was a vestryman in his local parish in the Anglican Church. And then, of course, James Madison married someone outside of his faith too.
Madison's raised in the Anglican faith. His dad's a vestryman. Speaking of comparisons, Mason's essentially the age of Madison's father, right? So Mason's about 20 years older, a little bit more or less. He's there in the Tidewater right along the Potomac, and Madison's out in the Piedmont. The family, the grandparents have moved out to the Piedmont for new soil for the tobacco, but raised as an Anglican. Now, I can't say to the audience that Madison's an Anglican, Episcopalian, or Christian, certainly a Christian worldview, but no surprise that the architect of the Bill of Rights hides that. He hides his religious faith from us. It seems that we really don't have a statement of faith, so much of a talking about the Christian faith. But he marries Dolly Madison, who had been a Quaker. Marries very well to Dolly Madison because she can teach him some political skills, just like George Mason. So she's read out of meeting. So you've got this riskiness of Colonel Mason marrying a Catholic in Virginia, which is certainly out of the ordinary, and Madison marrying a Quaker from who's been raised in Philadelphia. And then I think we've got to acknowledge, Rebecca, and our sites really try to do this. I hope you can come to Gunston Hall or Montpelier. These guys are both enslavers, and we don't get a Declaration of Rights in Virginia. We don't get a Bill of Rights, certainly for James Madison, without the labor of enslaved people. He doesn't get to go to boarding school and learn these languages. He doesn't get to go to Princeton, out of state for college. He doesn't get to spend time in politics, right? If he's an independent farmer, he's trying to keep the food on the table. Madison never wants for food on the table, right? Despite his 105, 110 pounds, taking care of the animals, fixing the windows, that's not Madison can apply himself, because at Montpelier, what's about 100 to 120 enslaved people on any given day. Rebecca, maybe you want to speak to that at Gunston Hall.
Yeah, and Mason inherits a pretty amazing amount of property, both in terms of people and land, and he turns that into more wealth throughout his life. It's certainly a very similar situation, that the two were quite privileged, and both of them talk through their lives about the problems with slavery. George Mason, for instance, calls slavery a slow poison to the country. He talks about it as an evil, and yet we have no evidence that he ever gave freedom to any of the people he kept in bondage. It's one of the questions that visitors ask about often. It's one of the questions we talk about often, because it's really hard for us to reconcile the beautiful language about personal liberties that George Mason included in the Virginia Declaration of Rights and his strenuous advocacy later for a US Bill of Rights with his denial of rights to the people he kept in slavery.
Right. That both and, Rebecca, is so difficult. Both an amazing legacy by both of these men that's affecting arguably us and much of the Western world in some ways today, even beyond the Western world. And they're treating people as property, and they're continuing this system. Madison, we have an exhibit here called The Mere Distinction of Color. It's from a quote Madison makes in Philadelphia in 1787. And it sounds like he's talking about the terrible aspects of slavery. He says, we've seen the mere distinction of color made in the most enlightened period of time, a ground for the most oppressive dominion ever exercised by man over man. That sounds pretty condemning of slavery. What he's actually making an argument for is factions. So Madison's going to talk about the evils of slavery for over 60 years. And like you pointed out with George Mason, he's not going to free anybody. So we're not trying to put these men on a pedestal where there's no flaws, that there's flaws. How about education? Where's Colonel Mason get his education?
I actually, sorry, I want to break in because we've had a really great point that Rebecca just responded to in the chat, that we've got some great similarities, and that Madison can also be claimed by Presbyterians in his connection to John Witherspoon at Princeton, which I think is a really fabulous thing. But I also want to make sure that we're keeping to our time. And I know we also have some really awesome things to be sharing about some of the disagreements that Madison and Mason had, particularly over the Bill of Rights. So I want to propose to you both that we turn towards disagreement, because this is a really tense point, I think, for Madison and Mason in the 18th century.
Well, sure. And we don't want to make it sound as if they were so similar in every way. And in fact, Patrick brought up education. That is an example of a place in which their experiences diverged. So Madison had the benefit or the opportunity to go off to school. Mason stayed at home for his schooling. He was mostly educated by tutors and spent a little bit of time in a proprietary school, but was someone who didn't venture very far away from home. And in fact, going to the Constitutional Convention was an enormous undertaking for him. And that was the farthest that he ever traveled in his life. He'd never gone to Philadelphia before. He'd never gone that far away. And so the weight of the whole experience was something that he talked about, that it was hard for him to be in a place where the manners were unfamiliar. He talked about really not liking Philadelphia very much. And then they did go for an entire weekend to New York, and he didn't really like New York either. Did I mention he was kind of grumpy? They were united in the belief that it was important to replace the Articles of Confederation with a new form of government. And then when they got to Philadelphia, the two of them were two of the most active speakers at the Philadelphia Convention, or what we think of as the Constitutional Convention. They didn't always agree. And in the end, there was a really big point of disagreement. George Mason insisted that we needed to have a federal Bill of Rights. This is a really natural thing in some ways, because he had been the primary author of the Virginia Declaration of Rights. He believed in rights documents. Many of his fellow delegates or deputies didn't agree. And in fact, there was a vote, and there was a unanimous decision by states. Each state voted as a group or as a delegation against adding a Bill of Rights. And Mason was devastated. He left right before the signing of the document and refused to put his name to it. And then, instead of just going home and quietly being sad, he raised a huge furor about this, letting everybody know. I mean, everyone he could possibly think of, all of the things that he thought were wrong with the Constitution. And he made a long, long list, but the very top of his list was this idea that there is no Declaration of Rights. So we see these two guys who agreed with each other, who had so much respect for each other, then having this enormous difference of opinion. And we can see here, thank you, Lacey, for putting up this quotation from George Mason, just one of the things that he said about the need for a Bill of Rights, that the dangers must inevitably arise from the insecurity of our rights and privileges as they depend on vague, indefinite, and ambiguous implications. He said we need to be explicit at the federal level, protecting individual liberties by having a document dedicated to their protection.
Well, Madison's got a focus similar to Mason. Similar in that they've got this focus, Mason on protecting these rights, Madison on the Union. So they agree the Articles of Confederation isn't working. But this also shows how these founding fathers, they disagree so much. I mean, Patrick Henry, in some ways a great revolutionary, he doesn't even want to go to that convention, right? He's got a problem with that. Well, Madison's on the opposite end. He's getting ready in his upstairs library. You can almost see the window above in my screen there. And he writes what we call the Virginia Plan. And he's learned some things politically, partly under George Mason, and he gets Governor Randolph to introduce the Virginia Plan at Philadelphia in May, on the third day of the convention. So that's the focus. And Mason's participating, and Madison's saying things, and James Wilson and others are jumping in there, Gouverneur Morris. And we've almost got something ready to go in September. And that's when George Mason really starts pushing, we can't be signing this without a Bill of Rights. I guess, unfortunately, Rebecca, he only convinces, unfortunately for Mason, is Eldridge Gerry and Governor Randolph, the guy that Madison got to introduce the Virginia Plan in May. He joins with Mason, and they're the three people who don't sign, who have been there on September 17th, but those three don't sign the Constitution. But we're going to keep disagreeing, I think, Rebecca, because we've got to get the states to ratify, right? So are you pretty excited about going to this convention in Richmond and still saying the same theme there, that we need a Declaration of Rights or Bill of Rights?
Well, Mason was not reticent about sharing his opinion. So boy, did he want to participate in that ratifying convention. He was not able to get elected from Fairfax County because people were so upset that he had gone against George Washington. Essentially, George Washington was the president of the Constitutional Convention, and Mason was kind of jeopardizing this project that Washington was in charge of. And so he didn't get elected from Fairfax County. Not to worry. He owned land in Stafford County, and so he got elected to the ratifying convention from there. In the meantime, he was sending letters to everybody he knew. He was putting things in every person's pocket he possibly could about his objections to the Constitution. And so he ends up at the ratifying convention, and he speaks a lot, and he's a little bit grumpy. The word sarcastic is used sometimes to describe his comments and his way of speaking. But what we see is that people all up and down the Eastern Seaboard start repeating some of the same things that Mason's talking about, that, wait a minute, we need to have a Bill of Rights. So that Madison and Hamilton, the people who are advocating for ratification, really need to start defending why should we be ratifying the Constitution, as Mason just is relentless in his arguments against ratifying without making changes to the Constitution.
I've got a couple questions in the Q&A from Matthew. One of them, great question. Why would a delegate at the convention? So Matthew's taking us back to 1787 a little bit, the writing. Why would they oppose a Bill of Rights? And I'd say one of the things is states have the power. And so when they're there at Philadelphia, the states have Bill of Rights or Declaration of Rights. So the feeling is it's the states more who are going to trample on power, not this federal government. If anything, the argument is it's a limited government. It says there in Article 1, Section 8, mostly the things they can do. It's a limited government. Now, George Mason doesn't buy that, but that's the majority view of it's a new limited government, and states, you're going to have most of the power. And in a lot of ways that bears out in the initial practice. And it's still going to follow through to next year in 1788 as Virginia's ratifying. Matthew, I'll take one other question here about.
Well, now wait a minute. I've got something to add to that.
Please.
Yeah, we have a slightly different perspective at Gunston Hall. We focus sometimes on the fact that, you know, the Constitutional Convention had been going on for a long time and people were tired. Mason said, don't worry, it'll take me a mere few hours. I can just write out this document. And we're pretty sure that the reaction from a lot of his fellows was, it is not going to take just a few hours. Nothing has taken just a few hours at this convention, that every single word and every single clause was going to be subject for debate, and that some of them simply wanted to go home. Others did believe, I think, that there was no need for a Bill of Rights or a Declaration of Rights, because they genuinely believed that the structure of the document would protect the liberties of the people. And some said, you know, we just don't need it because of this state issue. All the states have these protections. But Mason said, this new government that we're creating here, it supersedes the states in so many ways. It will essentially nullify the state bills of rights or Declaration of Rights. We must have a Bill of Rights at the federal level to make sure we have those protections. So, I mean, it's hard to say exactly why. There are lots and lots of reasons that people give, but Mason certainly believed that this idea that the state bills of rights would continue to protect people was not true.
And I think maybe one of the arrows in Madison's quiver is that the Articles of Confederation is so bad, right? That while state power people like Patrick Henry like it, Articles of Confederation just doesn't work. And there's literally some shooting at each other between the states, not a common currency, not a common judiciary. There's a private army putting down the Shays Rebellion in Massachusetts. So there's a lot of reasons to, we need to get something done. And Madison will write at the end of his life, the importance of that union, that's his singular focus. He'll write, the advice deepest in my conviction, nearest to my heart, is that the union of the states be cherished and perpetuated. So he's got that focus on this new union, that the union of the states be cherished and perpetuated. But he gets some political pushback. And Mason, I think, who won't be quiet, is going to start to sway some people. There's a lot of people like George Mason who think this new government, wow, that's a new power and they could take away our rights. And Madison's going to have to run for office. I think you've got a great quote about Mason looking back on his younger Virginia statesman and looking back and reflecting. Rebecca, if you want to give us that one from talking about Madison's election process.
Absolutely. George Mason was getting pretty cross about all of this. He also, I think it's really important to understand, believed that that power just tended to corrupt, and he was concerned always about making sure that we put protections in to make sure that we were ready for that inevitable corruption. And here we see he's just gotten a little bit cynical about James Madison promising that he will, if he's elected to Congress, that he will make sure that a Bill of Rights gets added, that amendments get proposed to Congress, to the Constitution, so that we can have a Bill of Rights. And here Mason, is writing to one of his sons saying the fact was Mr. Madison knew that he could not be elected without making some such promises of amendments to the government.
I think that date's so interesting. I mean, we are, that's 2 years after the Philadelphia Convention, 1 year after Virginia ratifies. And it's even 6-8 months after Virginia ratifies that we first see James Madison saying, we need to amend the Bill of Rights. And it's when he's running against James Monroe. He's running against James Monroe because of Patrick Henry, who's kept James Madison out of the Senate. And now James Madison needs to run against James Monroe to be in the House. And James Monroe is an anti-federalist. He was voting essentially against this new Constitution, this new power, and Madison needs votes. So he appeals to religious minorities. He's appealing to Baptists, especially. And the first time we see Madison publicly talking about a need for Bill of Rights is a January 1789 letter. And I emphasize that January 1789 because it's a year and a half after the Philadelphia Convention. It's a year after the Virginia. And he's saying, right, as you said, if I'm elected, I'm going to offer amendments to the Constitution, specifically on rights of conscience, that free exercise that he'd been talking about with George Mason back in 1776. And he does beat James Monroe by about 300 votes. And he goes off to Congress and he starts to lay the groundwork for offering a Bill of Rights by writing George Washington's inaugural speech. And he puts in George Washington's speech, really the only specific is George Washington is going to look at Congress in New York City in 1789, and he's going to say, I leave it to your judgment to what amendments need to be made. But essentially George Washington's saying, there's a lot of people out there arguing we need a Bill of Rights. And I'll leave it to your judgment on how you do this. And Madison writes in for Washington, but don't act too soon because we're just getting this government started, and also don't limit the government. And so what we see with Madison in the Bill of Rights, building very much on what he did with George Mason 13 years earlier, but now he's 38. And what we see is rights that protect individuals, but don't limit this new federal government. And so First through 10th Amendment that get ratified, there's some more ideas in there, but all 26 of those rights offered by Madison, mostly they protect individual rights rather than limit the national government. And so now the anti-federalists don't have a real strong argument. It's not that they don't want changes. It's not that they don't want a second convention. And I wouldn't put Mason in the second convention. I don't think he's arguing for that.
Oh, he would have been very happy for a second convention. He had ideas. He had lots of ideas,
right.
Lots and lots and lots and lots of things that he thought should be fixed and added. And he would have, yes, been very pleased.
Right. But the argument, the steam in the argument, the wind in the sails is not so much there once that Bill of Rights is ratified 231, sorry, can't do math so well. But we're doing this on the anniversary, the 231st anniversary of the ratification of the Bill of Rights in Virginia, which is the state that gets us to 3/4 of the states to ratify the amendments.
Well, and Patrick, I think this is the compromise I think a pretty strong argument can be made that Madison didn't believe we really needed a Bill of Rights, but he was willing to agree to the addition of a Bill of Rights in order to help make sure that the document, the Constitution, did get ratified, and then that he would get elected, Mason says, to the first Congress. Mason didn't get everything he wanted either. His list of objections starts with, there is no Declaration of Rights, but he had a lot of other objections to the Constitution as well. He thought that there were other things that did need more attention. It wasn't, it was premature to sign the Constitution when the delegates in Philadelphia did. So, so we see here that Madison does something that he doesn't really think is necessary, but he does it for the greater good. And Mason, in the end, somewhat grudgingly, says, okay, he can support the new government. He still would really like some of the other stuff, but he's willing to go along with it now. And I think that that's when we look at these two guys who have this great respect for each other, and then they have a really big disagreement, but in the end, they both sort of give a little bit and are willing to do something or to get along together to support something that they think is really important for the country. And one of the things that I think is pretty amazing about the two of them is that they never really lose that respect for each other as they're going through all of those years of their lives. And thank you, Lacey. Here's a quotation from Mason to Thomas Jefferson after all of this this brouhaha over the addition of amendments to the Constitution that became the Bill of Rights. That Mason says that he, James Madison, as he's writing to Thomas Jefferson, is one of the few men whom, from a pretty thorough acquaintance, I really esteem. Now, remember where we started, that the committee appointed to write the Virginia Declaration of Rights was overcharged with useless members. This guy didn't mince words. He didn't have any problem saying when there was someone he didn't respect. And James Madison was one of the people he really esteemed.
Well, I'm sitting here on Montpelier, James Madison's lifelong home. I get paid from the Montpelier Foundation. I would love to tell you that Madison is thinking of the greater good and protecting individuals, but I have to admit, I agree with Rebecca that Madison's doing this politically. Jay Cost has written about this, about Madison as a politician. And when you said essentially he doesn't really think they're needed, he thinks he can make a political move and he can shape the Bill of Rights. Others have said that the people who wrote the Bill of Rights, so arguably Madison writes them, there's some editing as they go through Congress that summer of 1789. Who controls Congress in 1789? Madison's party, right? He's in the majority there. The parties haven't spread out so much, but he's really in that majority of they don't think they need a Bill of Rights. And yet Madison's going to introduce them. They're going to get passed by that House and Senate to get it done and out to the people. And so as much as I want to tell you he's foresighted, worried about individuals, I can't make that argument. But we certainly see the Bill of Rights. Who's it for? It's for minorities. It's for people who are facing trial. It's for people who want to speak about unpopular rights. It's for people who exercise a religion that's not the majority. If you're in the majority, you're fine, right? The legislature protects you, the governor protects you, the executive. The Bill of Rights is about protecting people who have a different view. And that's the way the court enforces them in general. We'd have to argue a long time about how the court enforces the Bill of Rights. But Madison's getting them done in 1789 for political reasons. So I'd love to tell you it's all for the greater good. I can't really give you that one.
But I think, as Mason continued to esteem Madison, Madison continued to say good things or feel good things about Mason, right?
Definitely. Great example of these guys arguing, but still continuing to work. And they're going to have serious disagreements in this major forum in Philadelphia, major forum in the state capitol in Richmond to ratify, and they're still going to keep talking. They're not going to hate each other. They may disagree 24 hours a day with each other, but they're not going to start just, burn down the house. And that ability to dialogue, I think, is so important. And Mason really changing Madison's mind in some ways. Again, I don't want to make Madison out as this saint who comes around to the need for a Bill of Rights, but changing Madison's mind. There was a note in the Q&A about the application. Certainly Madison would have implicitly agreed with judicial review when Chief Justice John Marshall standardizes that judicial review in 1803 with Marbury versus Madison. Madison might not like the result of that specific case, but the idea of judicial review is somewhat reflected in the Virginia plan. I mean, it's not quite like that, but the ability to negative a law. Madison, this one I'll give him foresight on. When he proposes the Bill of Rights, some of the words he does not get through are "no state shall." So when he stands up in New York City back in 1789, he uses the words "no state shall" in his speech with the idea, again, that states are going to be violating rights. He's written to Jefferson saying these parchment barriers, these declaration of rights, if you have a majority in a state, they still trample on these parchment barriers, these paper protections. And so Madison's idea with this union, and he talks about this a lot in Federalist 10, is this new system. When we talk about the Bill of Rights 231 years ago, we can't forget this new federal system, that ours is the first in the world in 1787. So where we've got the state power and this federal power. Madison thinks this new system is going to check majorities, because majorities can be a problem, whether it's a religious or property owning or some other geography, wealth, something like that. And when we have this new larger federal system, it's going to check majorities. And so he puts in the words "no state shall," which don't get adopted until 1868. 14th Amendment, we do get the words "no state shall" into the Constitution. And that is really going to be, and this is a little bit more Supreme Court issue, that's going to be the vehicle the Supreme Court uses to enforce the Bill of Rights against state violations, because we don't get an enforcement against state violations until after that 14th Amendment.
I want to pop in and say we have hit the point of our program where we really want to start addressing questions from our visitors. We've got one more sitting in the chat and Q&A. If you have other questions, feel free to drop them in the chat and the Q&A. I'll be keeping an eye out for those. While we give you a few seconds to put your thoughts together, get your questions in there, I'd like to invite Rebecca and Patrick to tell us a little bit more about what's going on at Gunston Hall and Montpelier in the next handful of weeks.
Patrick, why don't you go ahead?
Well, we've got closure to really work on the property January 2nd. So if you get a chance, come before January 2nd. If you come between Christmas and New Year's, children are free with a paying adult. So if you want to get out of the house when the children are out of school, you can bring them to Montpelier. There's lots of trails. There's lots of self-exploration besides the tour of the house. We do hope you take the tour of the house, but there's other things to do in your day. And then I would say in the winter, we get much less visitation in the winter. So I always recommend to guests, come in the winter. You're probably not going to get a full tour. You're probably going to get a semi-private tour. After the January closure, we're open weekends, holiday Mondays, January and February. Thanks, Rebecca.
I will absolutely second that here at Gunston Hall, you can also get a private tour if you come in the winter.
Yeah,
And
it's
we
great
mean a
place.
private tour in the sense of you show up, 10, 15, 20 are allowed on the tour. In our case, it's currently 18, but there's 2 or 4 of you. So it feels like a private tour.
Mm-hmm.
The winter is a fantastic time for people, local people, to visit these sites because, yes, we just don't have nearly as many visitors. And so it's a really wonderful time for us to be able to connect with the people who are on our tours in a really special way. We hope to see many of you soon at Gunston Hall. We are open daily. We also have a closure in January, so we'll be closed for January 1st through the 20th, but otherwise we are open every single day for the next few months except Christmas Day. We also hope that we'll see you online. We have our History in the Kitchen program that is coming up, and we have an archaeology symposium that will be a day-long program in the late winter. So check www.gunstonhall.org for details about each of our programs. And again, we hope to see you sometime soon. I think we've got a couple of questions. Is that?
We sure do. We have a question that has been sitting with us for a little while. Did Madison's views on religious freedom influence his switch from the Federalists to the Democratic Republicans? This is obviously a little bit later in American history.
The difficulty here is language and Federalist. Madison's not a member of the Federalist Party that Hamilton and Adams and others who want more national power are going to be. That's going to come a little bit later, a year or two into the new government. He would be considered a Federalist in terms of being one of the primary authors of the Federalist Papers. It's not a party. So same terms, spelled the same way, but one is Federalist, meaning they support the Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want to do some great political branding, call your opponents anti, right? So call your opponents anti-Federalist, put them in the negative. So we get this early distinction between anti-Federalists don't want this new Constitution, somewhat more happy with the revising the articles. Articles need to be updated, but let's keep that system. And then you get the Federalists who are saying, no, we need a new system. And we should ratify the Constitution. Not the same as the Federalist Party. And so Madison and Jefferson will be called Democratic Republicans. They'll be called Jeffersonians. They'll be called different Democrats sometimes. But he doesn't really switch. He does not switch parties. He switches from being a backer of the Constitution. And I consider the Federalist Papers maybe the best propaganda in world history. I mean, it's an argument to do something politically. It's propaganda. We usually think of that as negative. But these Federalist Papers that Hamilton starts, recruits John Jay, and thankfully recruits Madison, it's an argument to ratify the Constitution. So that's where we get that Federalist term of these letters to the people of New York that are getting circulated throughout the colonies somewhat to, sorry, not the colonies, through the Confederation somewhat to ratify the Constitution.
It's always challenging that terms when we switch from colonies to states, sort of, and then definitely states. When we get the United States Constitution, it's a tricky transition there. We have another question. Why did the Federalists oppose the Bill of Rights? I think we've answered some of this a little bit, but Rebecca, Patrick, I'd love to invite you to share a little bit more.
Rebecca, I feel like Mason in some ways could be called the Federalist because he likes the Constitution. He just doesn't like there's not a Bill of Rights.
Yeah, in his with his objections, he kind of launches himself into the anti-federalist camp, and we often think of him as one of the kind of architects for anti-federalism. But I think you make a really strong point. At his heart, in many ways, I think he had an awful lot of agreement with the Federalists. And in fact, that's one of the things that Madison says later about Mason, is that the two of them actually did agree on many, many points. The big difference that I see is that the Federalists had, they insisted, who knows what they really believed. We know that they wanted the Constitution ratified. That was their most important consideration. And that they insisted that the protections that existed in the structure of the document, added to the protections for individual liberties at the state level, would make it all be okay. And I think this is where we see Mason's just inherent distrust of government and his conviction that government tended towards corruption, and that we needed to do everything we possibly could to create limits on government and to make it put in place ways to prevent corruption that he just wasn't willing to trust in the same way that the Federalists seem to. And again, I'm not sure, without having done all of the deep intellectual history research on every one of the Federalists, how much that was really something that was their conviction versus something that it was expedient because they really, really believed it was important to get the Constitution ratified. They worried if we had a second convention, it would never get done. And they thought, I think it's fair to say, they thought it was more important to have an imperfect document than no document at all.
Right. And Madison's very worried about that second convention. But these two, George Mason and James Madison, really sharpen each other in a lot of ways, right? They starting in 1776, where Mason's doing 99.9% of the heavy lifting, and Madison's helping out a little bit. And then they're kind of in their prime, even though they're 20 years different. But they push each other. And they listen to each other, and they disagree, but they listen to each other. And I think the questions that we've had either in the chat or the Q&A show this, people wrestling, well, maybe John Locke wasn't such a great philosopher or something like that. And it's so much fun when you come on our sites and engage with this, because what we try to do at our sites is be descriptive. Not to tell you should believe what George Mason believed or believe what James Madison believed, but describe what they did and what they believed. And then you walk away with your own evaluation of the founding, and then this democracy or republic, right? That it's a government of the people, that it's the republic, the thing of the people. The Latin translation is the thing, res, res, publica, of the people. That we need to keep engaging it with it. We need to keep disagreeing about it. We need to keep agreeing about it. We need to keep listening. We need to keep pushing each other on how do we make this system better.
One of the things that we talked about as we were designing this program is that here we've got an example of two guys who didn't agree on everything, and we're still able to get some really important things done together. And I think that I certainly am grateful that we have the Bill of Rights. I appreciate the way in which the two of them continued to interact with each other and to eventually work together and find a way to compromise and to continue to respect each other through all of that. I do like to think of the addition of the Bill of Rights to the federal Constitution as George winning. And particularly not just that he won at that moment, but I think that in history he has won. I think it'd be hard to find many Americans who would say that they would prefer not to have a Bill of Rights today. And so I so appreciate the struggle that he went through to make sure that that this thing that was so important to him happened.
Absolutely. Any other questions that we're missing from the chat?
We have answered all of our questions that our guests have shared with us today. Such amazing questions too, really awesome thoughts that have been shared with us, really great questions. It's so fabulous that all of you were able to join us this evening and share in this really amazing discussion. I was telling Rebecca and Patrick earlier today, I'm sure I'm going to learn something this evening, and I absolutely did. So many things that I did not know about Madison. I think this is just really, really fascinating. So I'm really glad that you all were able to join us from home. I am so glad, Rebecca and Patrick, that you were able to join us and share all of this amazing knowledge with us this evening. Thank you so much, everyone. And we hope to see you the next time we have a program on Zoom or in person.
And happy Bill of Rights Day.
Yes, happy Bill of Rights Day.
Something we can agree on.
See you all next time.